There are places in Texas where the earth refuses to keep secrets, where the soil, dark and heavy with memory, eventually surrenders what was buried in haste and hidden in shame. This is a story about one of those places. But more than that, it's a story about the night when hundreds of people stopped breathing, all at once, across a landscape that stretched for miles. And how, for more than 3 decades, no one was allowed to ask why. The wind moves differently over unmarked graves. Ask anyone who spent time in forgotten cemeteries, in fields where the dead lie without stones to mark their passing, and they'll tell you the same thing. The air feels heavier somehow, colder, as if the ground itself remembers what was taken from it. In the spring of 1891, a man named Samuel Grove learned this truth in the worst possible way. Samuel had come to Texas seeking silence. He'd fought for the Union during the war, spent 3 long years watching men die in ways that still visited him in dreams. Antietam, Gettysburg, names that carried the weight of thousands of bodies, thousands of mothers who would never see their sons again. After the war ended, after he'd mustered out and tried to find work that didn't remind him of death, his lungs began to fail him. A winter campaign in Virginia had left him with a rattling cough that wouldn't fade, a tightness in his chest that grew worse with each cold season, so he moved south. To warmth, to isolation, to a plot of land 12 miles outside Austin that came cheaper than it should have. The previous owner had abandoned the property decades earlier, leaving behind nothing but a collapsed shack and fields that had returned to wilderness. Samuel didn't ask questions. He'd seen enough of the world to know that cheap land usually came with stories people didn't want to tell. He told himself it didn't matter. He wasn't looking for history. He was looking for peace. The land seemed perfect at first, isolated enough that he wouldn't have to explain his Yankee accent to suspicious neighbors, close enough to town that he could buy supplies when needed. Priced well below market value, which suited a man living on a modest railroad pension. He'd build a barn first, then a proper house. Start small, start simple, start over. It was a Tuesday morning in March when his shovel struck something that wasn't supposed to be there. The bone surfaced slowly, emerging from the dark Texas soil like something rising from deep water. Pale, unmistakable. Samuel stopped digging immediately, his shovel frozen in midair, his breath caught in his throat. He'd seen enough death during the war to recognize human remains without hesitation. This wasn't some animal bone, some remnant of a deer or cow that had died and decomposed in the field. This was human. This was someone. The bone was old, weathered, stripped clean by time and earth and whatever small creatures lived beneath the surface. Not recent then. Not a murder that needed immediate reporting, but still, he should have stopped right there, should have marked the spot, walked into town, contacted the sheriff and let the authorities handle it. That would have been the proper thing to do, the legal thing. But something made him continue. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe it was something deeper, something that had been carved into him during those 3 years of war, when he walked across battlefields looking for wounded men among the corpses, when he'd learned to read the stories that bodies told. He set aside the shovel and began working with his hands, carefully now, almost tenderly, brushing away soil with the kind of gentle precision you'd use to uncover something precious. Within an hour, he'd found 3 more bones. By noon, he'd uncovered evidence of at least 5 bodies, all buried together in what appeared to be a single shallow trench. Samuel worked through the afternoon with mounting dread, his hands moving automatically while his mind tried to make sense of what he was finding. The bodies had been buried without coffins, without any apparent ceremony. They were piled atop one another, limbs tangled, skulls positioned at odd angles that spoke of hasty disposal rather than respectful interment. This wasn't how you buried people you loved. This wasn't how you buried people you considered human. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, he'd identified 17 distinct skeletons, 17 people, 17 souls, buried together in a trench that shouldn't exist, on land that had been sold and resold and finally abandoned, as if the ground itself carried a curse that kept people from staying. The bones told stories to someone who knew how to read them. Samuel had worked briefly as a gravedigger after the war, before the railroad hired him and gave him something to do, besides think about death. He'd learned to recognize the signs of how people had lived by examining how they died. The compression in vertebrae that came from years of heavy labor, the worn joint surfaces that indicated a lifetime of physical work, the stress fractures that spoke of bodies pushed beyond their limits, worked until they degraded under the strain. These were people who'd been worked hard, worked constantly, worked to death perhaps, though the bones couldn't tell him that with certainty. What they could tell him was that something was wrong. The burial was wrong. The positioning was wrong. But more than that, there was a consistency to the remains that troubled him deeply. In mass graves from the war, bodies accumulated over time. You could see variations in decomposition in how they'd been placed, in the progression of burial. But these looked as though they'd all been interred at the exact same moment, as though 17 people had died simultaneously and been dumped into a trench together all at once before rigor mortis had even set in. Samuel stood in the gathering darkness, surrounded by bones, and felt something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with his damaged lungs. What could kill 17 people at the same time? Disease, perhaps. Cholera could sweep through a community with terrible speed, but even cholera took time. People got sick in stages. Some died quickly, others lingered. There was progression, pattern. This looked different. This looked like everyone had simply stopped breathing within hours of each other. He spent that night sitting on the porch of his temporary shelter, unable to sleep, watching the place where he'd uncovered the dead. The wind moved through the cedar trees with a sound like whispering, and Samuel found himself listening, straining to hear words in that rustling. Names he'd never know, stories he'd never hear. 17 voices calling out from beneath the earth. He told himself it was just the wind. He told himself it didn't matter. The dead were dead, whoever they were, and nothing he did now would change what had happened to them. But he couldn't make himself believe it. He'd seen too many bodies during the war. He'd walked through too many fields where the dead lay unburied, unclaimed, unnamed. He knew what it meant when people were disposed of instead of mourned. The sheriff arrived the following morning, accompanied by the county coroner. Sheriff Wilson was a broad man with some weathered skin and eyes that revealed nothing. The coroner, Dr. Turner, Philip Reeves, was tall and thin and humorless, carrying a leather medical bag and an expression of professional detachment that Samuel recognized from army surgeons, men who'd seen too much death to be moved by it anymore. They examined the bones with methodical efficiency, making notes, taking measurements, conferring in low voices that Samuel couldn't quite hear. He watched their faces carefully, looking for any sign of surprise or concern. He saw none. Whatever they were finding in that trench, it wasn't unexpected. It wasn't shocking. It was something they'd seen before, or something they'd been trained to expect. After an hour of examination, Dr. Drin, Reeves straightened up and announced his conclusion with the kind of certainty that discouraged questions. Slave graves, probably from before the war. Not uncommon to find unmarked burials on old plantation properties. The words hung in the air between them. Slave graves, as if that explained everything. As if that made it normal to find 17 bodies piled in a shallow trench without markers, without ceremony, without any indication that they'd been buried by people who cared whether they were remembered. Samuel felt something twist in his stomach. Was there a plantation here? He asked carefully. Sheriff Wilson consulted a small notebook, flipping through pages with deliberate slowness. Property was owned by the Garrett family before the war, he said. Small operation, maybe 40 or 50 slaves. The family left Texas in 1867, sold the land for taxes. It's changed hands 4 times since then. 17 people is a lot to lose to disease, Samuel said, choosing his words with care, trying not to sound accusatory, trying not to sound like a Yankee who didn't understand how things worked in Texas. Dr. Reeves shrugged, a gesture so casual it made Samuel's jaw tighten. Cholera could take that many in a week, the coroner said. Smallpox, typhoid, any number of illnesses. The record-keeping for slave deaths was minimal at best. Plantation owners rarely documented such losses unless they were filing insurance claims or estate inventories. "And if there are no records?" Samuel pressed. "Then we do what we can," Sheriff Wilson said. His voice was flat, final. "We'll have the remains reinterred in the county cemetery. I'll make a note in the official log. Beyond that," he spread his hands in a gesture of finality, "these people have been dead for 30 years or more. There's no crime to investigate, no justice to pursue. We give them a decent burial and move on." Samuel wanted to argue, wanted to point out that 17 simultaneous deaths deserved more than a notation in a logbook, wanted to demand that someone investigate, that someone ask questions about what had really happened on this land. But he recognized the futility even as the impulse rose in his throat. These were black bodies, enslaved bodies, and to men like Sheriff Wilson and Dr. Reeves they were historical footnotes at best, inconveniences at worst. The investigation, such as it was, ended before it truly began. The bones were collected in rough wooden boxes and buried in an unmarked section of the county cemetery designated for paupers and unknowns. No individual graves, no separate markers, just a collective pit where the 17 were interred together for a second time, as anonymous in death as they'd been forced to be in life. Samuel attended the brief ceremony. He was the only murder. A local minister said a few words about Christian charity and eternal rest, speaking in the kind of vague platitudes that required no knowledge of who these people had been, what they'd suffered, how they'd died. The words washed over Samuel like rain, meaningless and cold. When it was finished, when the boxes had been lowered into the ground and covered over with earth, Samuel stood alone in the cemetery and tried to think of something to say, some prayer or acknowledgement. But what words could possibly be adequate? What prayer could reach back through 30 years of silence and say to these 17 souls that someone finally had noticed they were gone? He built his barn 20 feet west of where he'd found the graves. He tried not to think about what lay beneath his land, about the 17 people whose names he'd never know, whose lives had been erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. But some nights, when the wind moved through the cedar trees, he imagined he could hear them. Whispers, voices, 17 souls calling out from the darkness. He told himself it was just the wind. He told himself it didn't matter, that the dead were beyond caring whether anyone remembered them. He was wrong about both. Because 3 years later, in the spring of 1894, nearly 200 miles southeast of Austin, someone else would make a discovery that would begin to reveal the truth. A discovery that would eventually pull back the veil on one of the darkest secrets in Texas history. A secret that had been buried as deliberately and as cruelly as the bodies themselves. And this time, the person who found the bones wouldn't let the matter rest. This time, someone would ask the questions that Samuel Hargrove had been discouraged from asking. Someone would demand answers. Someone would refuse to accept that hundreds of human beings could simply die and be forgotten, erased from history as if they'd never drawn breath. Her name was Dr. Mouth, Catherine Brennan. And she was about to discover that the 17 bodies Samuel had found were just the beginning. The town of Beaumont sat in the humid lowlands of southeast Texas, a place where cotton had once been king and fortunes had been built on the backs of enslaved labor. By 1894, the old plantation system had collapsed, replaced by a different kind of ambition. Progress, they called it. Development. The transformation of agricultural land into residential neighborhoods for a growing middle class that wanted modern homes with ornamental gardens and tree-lined streets. Harold Fitzpatrick was a banker from Galveston with exactly that kind of vision. He'd purchased a former cotton plantation that had been subdivided and sold after the war, and he had ambitious plans for the property, a neighborhood of elegant homes, a central park, an ornamental pond that would serve as the crown jewel of the development. A place where families could stroll on Sunday afternoons and children could sail toy boats while their parents discussed property values and the bright future of Texas. Excavation for the pond began in April of 1894. The workers were mostly day laborers, a mix of black and white men grateful for any employment during an economic downturn. They'd been digging for 3 days, removing clay-heavy soil by the wagon load, when the first skull emerged from the earth. The crew foreman was a man named Cyrus Webb. He'd been born enslaved on a plantation in Louisiana, had survived the war and Reconstruction, and had developed a deep, abiding suspicion of any unmarked graves found on former plantation land. When he saw that skull staring up from the excavation pit, earth-stained and eyeless, he didn't hesitate. He immediately halted the work. "Could be murder," he told Harold Fitzpatrick when the banker arrived to inspect the site, his polished shoes collecting mud as he approached the excavation. "Could be disease, could be a lot of things. But this ain't right, and we need to know what happened before we build houses on top of it." Fitzpatrick was less concerned with historical truth than with the delay to his development schedule. Every day of stopped work meant lost money, meant investors asking questions, meant potential buyers looking at other properties. But he recognized the danger in simply burying the bones and continuing as if nothing had been found. A murder investigation could tie up the property for months, destroy his investment before it even began. Better to bring in an expert, get an official determination of natural death, and move forward with a clear conscience and legal protection. He contacted the medical college in Galveston, requesting someone who could examine the remains and provide a professional assessment that would satisfy any future questions. Someone with credentials, someone whose report would carry weight if questions were asked. They sent in Dr. Catherine Brennan. Catherine arrived in Beaumont on April 23, 1894, carrying 2 leather cases filled with measuring instruments, chemical testing equipment, and notebooks bound in dark cloth. She was 31 years old, one of only a handful of female physicians in Texas, and the only one specializing in what she called medical history and forensic analysis. Her reputation had been built on meticulous research and a refusal to accept convenient explanations without evidence. The medical establishment tolerated her barely because her work was too good to dismiss outright. She published papers on burial practices, on historical disease patterns, on methods for determining time of death from skeletal remains. She testified in court cases about suspicious deaths. She'd examined bodies that other doctors preferred not to see, asked questions that made powerful men uncomfortable. She focused on historical questions rather than competing for living patients, which meant she wasn't a direct threat to the male physicians who dominated the profession. But she made them uneasy nonetheless, this woman who asked difficult questions about bodies that polite society preferred to forget. The excavation site shocked her, though she was careful not to show it. By the time she arrived, the workers had uncovered evidence of at least 22 bodies, all buried in a single mass grave, approximately 12 feet long and 6 feet wide. The bodies had been laid out in rough rows, 3 or 4 deep, without coffins or wrapping. There was no evidence of personal effects, no buttons or jewelry or fabric remnants that might indicate clothing. Just bones, human bones, piled together like cordwood. Catherine spent 3 days at the site, working from dawn until the light failed. She documented the position of each skeleton with the precision of a surveyor, making detailed sketches that showed exactly how the bodies had been arranged. She took measurements of every skull, every femur, every intact bone that could provide information about age, sex, height, evidence of disease or injury. She examined the bones for signs of trauma, looking for bullet holes in skulls, blade marks on ribs, any evidence that would indicate violent death. She found none. No signs of murder, no battlefield casualties. No evidence of the kind of trauma that would suggest these people had been killed. But she found something else, something that made her careful scientific mind rebel against the implications. The bones told a consistent story. These were people who'd lived hard lives. The modifications to bone structure that came from heavy labor were evident in every adult skeleton: enlarged muscle attachment points, compression fractures in vertebrae, wear patterns on joints that spoke of repetitive motion, of bodies used as tools, of people worked until their skeletal structure itself bore witness to their suffering. There were men, women, and children, infants who'd lived only months, elderly individuals whose bones showed the accumulated damage of decades of brutal labor. And all of them, every single one, had been buried at the same time, not over weeks, not even over days, all at once in a single hurried act of disposal. Catherine worked with methodical precision, but inside, something was building. Anger, perhaps, or grief, or the cold fury that comes from seeing evidence of an atrocity and knowing that no one had ever been held accountable. These people had died. They'd been buried without ceremony, without markers, without any acknowledgement of their humanity. And then they'd been forgotten, erased from history as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. She needed to know when this had happened. She needed to establish a timeline. Catherine had developed a technique for estimating post-mortem intervals based on dental wear patterns and mineral absorption. It wasn't perfect. The science was still developing, still being refined. But teeth absorbed trace elements from groundwater over time, creating chemical signatures that could be analyzed. Combined with other evidence like burial depth and soil composition, it could provide rough dates. She extracted small enamel samples from 12 different individuals, enough for a statistically meaningful analysis. She was careful, precise, treating each sample with the kind of respect you'd show to evidence in a murder trial. Because that's what this was, really. A murder trial that was 30 or 40 years too late, a reckoning that should have happened decades ago, but had been prevented by people who valued property over human life. She sent the samples to a colleague at the medical college in Galveston. Dr. Lawrence Miller was a chemist who specialized in mineral analysis, a careful man who understood the importance of precision. She didn't tell him what she was testing or why, just asked for a complete elemental breakdown of each sample. She didn't want his analysis influenced by expectations or assumptions. The results arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope. Dr. Miller's note was brief, written in his characteristically precise handwriting. "Interesting samples," he wrote. "The mineral profiles are remarkably consistent, suggesting a very narrow time frame for burial. Based on the mineral saturation levels and soil composition data you provided, I would estimate these remains were interred approximately 35 to 40 years ago, likely within a span of 24 to 48 hours. The consistency across all samples is unusual. In most historical burials, even mass graves show more variation." Catherine read the note 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. 35 to 40 years ago would place the burials around 1854 to 1859, and the time frame, 24 to 48 hours, meant all 22 people had been buried at essentially the same time, not over weeks of epidemic disease, not even over days, really, within a period so brief that the earth itself couldn't distinguish between them. She sat in her study, surrounded by notes and sketches and photographs of bones, and tried to make sense of it. What kind of event could kill 22 people simultaneously on a plantation in southeast Texas during the 1850s? Disease was the obvious answer. Cholera could kill quickly. Typhoid, yellow fever, any number of illnesses that swept through communities with terrible efficiency, but even the most virulent epidemics took time to spread through a population. People didn't all die on the same day. There would be variations, patterns of spread, progression. The first cases, then more, then the peak, then the decline. Some people would survive. There would be witnesses, people who'd nursed the sick, people who'd buried the dead and could tell you what had happened. This didn't look like disease. This looked like something sudden, something that had struck all at once and then disappeared, leaving behind only silence and unmarked graves. Catherine needed more information. She needed to understand what kind of event could cause such symptoms, and more importantly, why it would have been concealed. Why would plantation owners choose to bury their dead in secret rather than report the deaths and seek official investigation? She returned to Galveston and began her research in earnest, diving into archives with the single-minded focus that had made her reputation. She needed plantation records from Beaumont for the relevant time period. Death records, tax documents, any documentation that might explain what had happened on this land during the late 1850s. What she found was silence, a deliberate, carefully maintained silence that spoke louder than any confession. The plantation had been owned by a man named Edgar Sutton, who'd operated what records described as a successful cotton enterprise with approximately 60 enslaved workers. Sutton had died in 1866, and his estate had been liquidated to pay war debts. The property records existed, meticulously noting the transfer of land from one owner to another. But there were no detailed ledgers, no journals, no personal papers that might shed light on the day-to-day operations of the plantation or the fate of the people who'd been enslaved there. Either the records had been lost, scattered through decades of neglect in the chaos of war and reconstruction, or they'd never been preserved in the first place. Catherine suspected the latter. Some silences weren't accidental. Some absences were deliberate acts of erasure. She expanded her search to county death records. Texas had required the registration of deaths since 1853, though compliance was spotty at best, especially in rural areas and especially regarding enslaved populations. She spent weeks in dusty county offices going through ledgers page by page, looking for any entry that might correspond to the Beaumont burial. She found scattered entries for slave deaths on the Sutton plantation between 1855 and 1860. Field hand, male fever, age unknown. Child, female, stillborn. Kitchen worker, cause uncertain. The entries were vague, deliberately so. Plantation owners had little incentive to provide detailed death records for enslaved people. It raised questions about health conditions, about working practices, about the value and treatment of their remaining human property. But she found no entry corresponding to a mass death event. No record of 22 people dying within days of each other, nothing that would explain the grave she'd excavated in Beaumont. Either the deaths had never been officially reported, or the records had been deliberately destroyed. Catherine was leaning toward the former, but she suspected both might be true. An unreported mass death event, followed by the systematic destruction of any evidence that might have survived in private papers or plantation ledgers. Someone had worked very hard to make sure these deaths were forgotten. Catherine published a preliminary report of her findings in the Journal of Southern Medical History in October of 1894. The article was technical, carefully worded, focused on her forensic methodology and the challenges of estimating burial dates from skeletal remains. She mentioned the Beaumont discovery, but framed it as one example among many of the historical documentation gaps that made researching slave mortality patterns so difficult. She didn't expect the article to generate much response. The journal had a small circulation, mostly medical professionals and academic researchers with specialized interests. But in December of 1894, she received a letter that would change everything. The letter came from Houston, written in cramped but legible handwriting on 8 pages of cheap paper. The author was a land surveyor named Thomas Gaines, who'd been working throughout eastern Texas for nearly 30 years, mapping property boundaries for legal disputes, railroad development, and commercial transactions. Dear Dr. Brennan, the letter began, I read your recent article with great interest, as it touches upon something I have observed repeatedly in my professional work, but never fully understood. I am writing to share my observations, in hopes they may assist your research. What followed was a detailed account of 17 separate sites where Thomas had encountered unmarked mass burials during his surveying work. 17 sites scattered across eastern Texas, each containing between 15 and 25 bodies buried without coffins in shallow graves. He documented each discovery, made notes, tried to understand what he was seeing, but he'd never put the pieces together until he read Catherine's article. All the sites shared specific characteristics. All were located on properties that had operated as plantations between 1850 and 1865. All showed evidence of hasty burial in marginal areas of properties, often in disputed territory between property lines, or in areas marked as wasteland on period maps. And perhaps most significantly, at 3 sites where Thomas had been able to measure root growth patterns from trees that had grown through the graves, the evidence suggested all 3 dated to approximately the same period, the late 1850s or very early 1860s. Catherine spread the enclosed maps across her study floor, her heart pounding. 17 sites, plus the Beaumont grave and Samuel Hargrove's discovery near Austin, which she'd learned about through a newspaper clipping. 19 sites total, approximately 350 to 400 bodies, based on rough estimates. She stared at the map for hours, looking for patterns. The sites weren't randomly distributed. They clustered in certain regions, particularly in the northeast corner of the state. Some were separated by only 20 or 30 miles. Others were more isolated, scattered across central and southeast Texas. This wasn't isolated incidents. This wasn't individual plantation disasters. This was something larger, something coordinated, something that had affected multiple locations across hundreds of miles of territory, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one ever asked questions about it. Catherine wrote back to Thomas Gaines immediately, thanking him for the information and asking if he'd be willing to assist in field examinations of the sites he'd documented. His response came within a week. He was not only willing, but eager. He offered his surveying expertise, his wagon and equipment, and his knowledge of the terrain. "Before you continue your research," he wrote in a postscript, "there is something you should know. I have surveyed land for many powerful families in Texas. When word spreads of what you are investigating, and it will spread, you will face resistance. There are people whose fortunes were built on plantation wealth, whose family names are still respected, who will not welcome questions about what their ancestors did or failed to do. Be careful, Dr. Brennan. The truth you are seeking has been buried for a reason." Catherine read the warning and felt something cold settle in her chest. But she didn't hesitate. She'd spent her entire career asking questions that made powerful men uncomfortable. She wasn't going to stop now, not when hundreds of people were calling out from unmarked graves, demanding to be remembered. Not when the pattern was becoming clear, even if she didn't yet understand what it meant. Not when every instinct she possessed told her that she was on the edge of uncovering something that had been hidden for decades. Something terrible, something that would shake the foundations of how Texas remembered its own history. She began writing letters to land offices in every county across eastern Texas, requesting information about discoveries of unmarked graves on former plantation properties, to county clerks asking about death records from the 1850s, to historical societies hoping to find local historians who might have documented such discoveries. The responses came slowly, filtered through bureaucracy and indifference, and the simple chaos of poorly maintained archives. Many counties had no records. Fires had destroyed their archives. Floods had turned documents to pulp. Simple neglect had reduced history to dust. But 6 counties provided information about specific sites that matched the pattern. Mass graves hastily buried, no markers dating to the antebellum period. Catherine added them to her map with shaking hands. 25 sites, 500 or more confirmed dead, all buried the same way, all from approximately the same time period, and she still didn't know why. She needed to understand the mechanism. What could kill so many people across such a wide area? What kind of event would leave behind this particular pattern of death and concealment? She needed expertise she didn't possess. She needed someone who could explain what natural phenomenon might cause simultaneous deaths across hundreds of miles of territory. She needed a geologist, and by extraordinary fortune, or perhaps by the same inexorable force that had led her to this investigation in the first place, she found exactly the right person at exactly the right time. His name was Dr. Raymond Foster, and he was about to help her understand that what had killed these people wasn't just a tragedy. It was a catastrophe written in the very bones of the earth itself. Raymond Foster was 30 years old in the summer of 1895, a young professor at the University of Texas in Austin who'd already made a name for himself studying the geological formations beneath Texas soil, fault lines, underground resource deposits, the hidden architecture of rock and mineral that determined where oil would be found, where water would flow, where the earth itself might suddenly shift and crack. Catherine's letter reached him in August. She explained her research in general terms, described the burial sites she'd documented, and asked a question that must have seemed strange coming from a physician. Could geological phenomena explain localized toxic gas releases? Were there natural processes that might cause simultaneous deaths across a wide area? His response was immediate and enthusiastic. The question fascinated him. He wanted to know more. They met in Austin in September, in Raymond's cluttered office at the university. Catherine laid out her evidence with the precision of someone building a legal case. The burial sites, plotted on maps. The dates, estimated through dental analysis and soil samples. The newspaper reports she'd managed to find. The testimony from survivors that she'd only begun to collect. She showed him everything, holding nothing back, trusting that his scientific expertise would either confirm or dismiss her growing suspicion that these deaths were connected by something more than coincidence. Raymond studied the maps intently, occasionally pulling out geological survey maps for comparison. His fingers traced lines across the paper, following patterns that Catherine couldn't see, but that clearly meant something to him. After an hour of silent examination, he looked up with an expression that was equal parts excitement and dread. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly. "Look at this." He overlaid Catherine's burial site map with a geological survey showing subsurface formations. "See this line here," he continued, his finger tracing a diagonal path across the map. "This is the Mesher-Talco Fault Zone, a major geological structure that runs through eastern Texas. And here, these smaller lines, they indicate subsidiary faults and fracture zones associated with the main structure." Catherine leaned closer, and suddenly she could see what he was showing her. The burial sites clustered along those lines like beads on a string, following the fault zones with a precision that couldn't possibly be coincidental. "Now look at this," Raymond continued, pulling out another map. This one showed oil and gas deposits, areas where underground hydrocarbon reservoirs had been identified or suspected. Eastern Texas has significant underground deposits, oil, natural gas, various petroleum-related compounds. In most places, these deposits are sealed deep underground by impermeable rock layers. But along fault zones, there can be fractures, fissures that allow gases to migrate toward the surface. "You're suggesting a natural gas release," Catherine said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "Not just natural gas," Raymond corrected. "Natural gas is mostly methane, which is lighter than air. It rises and disperses quickly. But underground reservoirs often contain heavier gases as well. Carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, various sulfur compounds. These are heavier than air, and they can settle in low-lying areas like fog settling into a valley." He pulled out a chemistry reference book and opened it to a page on hydrogen sulfide. Catherine read the description with growing horror. Hydrogen sulfide was particularly deadly. At low concentrations, it smelled like rotten eggs, giving people warning to evacuate. But at higher concentrations, it overwhelmed the olfactory nerve. You couldn't smell it anymore, which meant you had no warning before it killed you. It caused rapid respiratory paralysis and death. And critically, it was heavier than air, so it settled in valleys and depressions instead of dispersing into the atmosphere. "That matches what I found," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Low-lying areas, respiratory symptoms, sudden death." "There's more," Raymond said, turning to another page. "Carbon dioxide is also heavier than air and deadly in enclosed spaces. It's odorless, which means people wouldn't necessarily smell it, but they'd experience symptoms before losing consciousness. Headaches, dizziness, difficulty breathing. In high concentrations, it causes asphyxiation. Could a geological event release enough of these gases to cause mass casualties?" Catherine asked. "Absolutely," Raymond replied without hesitation. "There's a famous case in Italy from centuries ago, and more recently, though after the time frame you're investigating, there was Lake Nyos in Cameroon, a volcanic lake that accumulated carbon dioxide from underground sources. Under certain conditions, the gas was released suddenly in what's called a limnic eruption. The gas cloud killed over 1,000 people in nearby villages. But there's no volcanic lake in Texas," Catherine pointed out. "No," Raymond agreed, "but you don't need a lake. You just need an underground gas pocket under pressure and a trigger to release it. Seismic activity can open fissures. Rapid temperature changes can alter underground pressure systems. Even heavy rainfall can shift geological formations enough to break seals on gas pockets." He pulled out meteorological data he'd already requested from the Texas State Weather Bureau, anticipating where this conversation would lead. "Look at this," he said. "Late November and early December of 1859 saw unusual weather patterns. A severe cold front moved through the region, dropping temperatures by 40 degrees in less than 24 hours. That kind of rapid change creates significant stress on underground formations. So your theory is that the cold front triggered a gas release from underground pockets along the fault zones," Catherine said. That's my working hypothesis, Raymond confirmed. The rapid temperature change created pressure differentials in underground formations. Gas that had been trapped for potentially thousands of years found pathways to the surface through fault-related fractures. The gas emerged in multiple locations, probably dozens of release points across the affected region. And it would have been heavier than air, Catherine continued, the full picture becoming clear. So it settled in low areas, and slave quarters were typically built in the lowest, least desirable parts of plantations. Exactly, Raymond said. People in elevated structures, or people who happened to be outdoors or in well-ventilated buildings, might have experienced only minor symptoms or avoided exposure entirely. But people sleeping in low, poorly ventilated quarters would have been exposed to lethal concentrations. How long would the gas persist? Catherine asked. Depends on wind conditions and the specific gas composition, Raymond explained. Hydrogen sulfide is reactive. It breaks down relatively quickly when exposed to air and moisture. Carbon dioxide is more stable, but would eventually disperse through atmospheric mixing. In favorable conditions, a gas cloud could persist for hours, even overnight. But by morning, especially with any wind movement, it would be gone, leaving behind only the dead, Catherine said quietly, and survivors who couldn't explain what had happened, Raymond added, and plantation owners who saw only financial disaster and legal liability. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they'd uncovered settling over them like a shroud. This wasn't just a tragedy. This was a natural disaster on a scale that should have been recorded in history books, studied by scientists, memorialized by the communities it affected. Instead, it had been deliberately concealed, erased from official records, buried as completely as the bodies themselves. Can we prove this? Catherine finally asked. Is there any way to confirm that a gas release occurred? Raymond considered the question carefully. Direct evidence would be difficult after so much time, he admitted. The gases themselves are long gone, but there might be indirect evidence. Mineral deposits associated with gas seepage, alterations in soil chemistry, historical records of similar minor events in the region that might indicate ongoing geological instability. I want you to examine the burial sites, Catherine said. Collect soil samples. Look for geological evidence. If we're going to publish this theory, we need more than speculation. Agreed, Raymond said. When can we start? As soon as possible. Over the following months, Catherine and Raymond conducted what would become one of the most comprehensive field studies of its kind. They visited every confirmed burial site, traveling by train and wagon across the vast expanse of eastern Texas. At each location, they worked with methodical precision. Catherine documented the remains, took measurements, collected samples. Raymond performed detailed geological surveys, examining the terrain, identifying fault features, collecting soil cores from various depths. He was looking for evidence of past gas seepage, chemical signatures in the soil, mineral deposits, alterations in rock structure that would indicate gases had moved through the earth and reached the surface. The results were suggestive but not conclusive. Several sites showed elevated levels of sulfur compounds in deep soil layers, consistent with past hydrogen sulfide exposure. 2 sites had mineral deposits characteristic of carbon dioxide interaction with limestone bedrock, but Raymond cautioned that these findings could have other explanations. The evidence was circumstantial, not definitive. What they did find was a consistent geographic pattern that couldn't be denied. Every burial site fell within 20 miles of a mapped or inferred fault line. Every site was in a low-lying area relative to the surrounding terrain. And when they plotted the sites on a topographic map, they could trace what might have been the path of a denser-than-air gas cloud moving downslope from multiple release points, following the contours of the land like water seeking the lowest ground. They also found more graves. At every location they visited, they asked local residents if they knew of other unmarked burial sites from the slavery era. Most didn't, but a few remembered stories. A farmer near Longview told them about a grave he'd found in 1887 while plowing a field. 22 bodies, all piled together. He'd reported it to the county, but they told him it was old slave graves and didn't require investigation. He'd buried them properly in the corner of his land and put up a stone marker. Seemed like the right thing to do, he said. He showed them the marker. a simple granite stone with the inscription, "Unknown Souls Found 1887. Rest in peace." Catherine and Raymond excavated a small test area with the farmer's permission. The bones showed the same characteristics as the other sites. Hasty burial, no coffins, evidence of hard labor during life. The same pattern, repeated over and over across hundreds of miles of Texas soil. By the end of 1896, Catherine's map included 38 confirmed sites. The estimated death toll exceeded 500 and was likely much higher. Many sites had probably never been discovered. Many discovered sites had never been properly documented, but all the confirmed sites dated to late 1859 or very early 1860. All showed evidence of simultaneous burial, all clustered around geological features that could plausibly have released toxic gases. The pattern was undeniable. Something had happened in eastern Texas in December of 1859, a natural disaster of terrible scope affecting hundreds of enslaved people across a wide geographic area. And then it had been deliberately concealed by plantation owners who feared the consequences of public knowledge. Catherine and Raymond prepared a joint paper for publication. Raymond would present the geological evidence and theoretical mechanism. Catherine would document the burial sites and historical evidence. Together they would argue that the December 1st, 1859 event represented one of the deadliest natural disasters in Texas history, one that had been erased from official records through a combination of racial indifference and deliberate suppression. But before they could publish, Catherine wanted one more piece of evidence. She wanted testimony from survivors. She wanted to hear, in their own words, what had happened on that terrible night. Finding survivors proved more challenging than expected. The events of December 1859 had occurred 37 years earlier. Anyone who'd been old enough to remember clearly would now be in their 50s or older. Many would have died. Others might have scattered after emancipation, leaving Texas for opportunities elsewhere, carrying their memories with them to places Catherine would never be able to reach. She began by contacting black churches across eastern Texas. These churches, many founded by formerly enslaved people after the Civil War, sometimes kept oral history records documenting the experiences of their founding members. She wrote to 73 churches explaining her research and asking if any church records included testimony about unusual deaths during the slavery period, particularly around December of 1859. The responses were sparse and often guarded. Many churches had no such records. Others were reluctant to share sensitive historical information with a white researcher they didn't know. The memories of slavery were painful, dangerous even. There were people still living who remembered when speaking openly about such things could get you killed. Trust had to be earned, not assumed. Catherine modified her approach. Instead of asking for records to be sent to her, she offered to visit churches in person, explain her research face-to-face, and work with church leadership to document testimonies in a respectful, appropriate manner. She emphasized that her goal wasn't to exploit these stories, but to ensure they were preserved, that the dead were finally acknowledged and honored. This approach worked better. She received invitations from 9 churches willing to meet with her. The first was New Hope Baptist Church in Texarkana. Reverend Marcus Webb, who'd written to Catherine after reading one of her preliminary articles, welcomed her with careful courtesy. He introduced her to the church's history committee, a group of elderly congregation members who maintained oral traditions and written records. "We've been preserving our history since the church was founded in 1866, Reverend Webb explained. Many of our founding members experienced slavery firsthand, and they wanted those experiences documented so their children and grandchildren would know what had been endured, what had been survived. He led Catherine to a small room behind the sanctuary where church records were stored on carefully organized shelves, ledgers bound in worn leather, protected from dust and moisture, maintained with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. These ledgers contain testimony from 15 founding members, he said. Several of them describe an incident in December of 1859 that matches what you've been researching. Catherine spent 3 days at New Hope, reading through the ledgers with Reverend Webb's assistance. The testimonies were written in plain, unadorned language that made them all the more devastating. They described lives of brutality and deprivation, families torn apart by sale, punishments both casual and calculated, the daily grinding horror of being treated as property, as tools, as things rather than people. And several described the night of December 1st, 1859. The first testimony was from a woman named Rachel Porter, recorded in March of 1868. Catherine read it with tears streaming down her face, unable to stop, unable to look away from the words that had waited 30 years to be heard. "My name is Rachel Porter," the testimony began. "I was born in 1836 on the Vernon Plantation outside Texarkana. I lived as a slave until freedom came in 1865. I am recording this testimony so my children will know where I come from and what was done to me and my people. I was 23 years old when the poison night came. We'd been working late, finishing the cotton harvest. When we finally returned to our quarters after dark, all we wanted was sleep. The smell started around 8 or 9 o'clock. At first I thought something was burning, but it wasn't smoke. It was chemical, wrong somehow. Made your nose burn if you breathed deep. My mother said it was swamp gas, but I'd smelled swamp gas before, and this was different. The babies started crying first. They couldn't catch their breath right, kept coughing and gasping. Then the old folks started having trouble. My grandmother said her chest felt tight, like something was sitting on it. I told everyone we should go outside, get away from the smell, but it was cold that night, near freezing, and most people were too tired to move. They just wanted to sleep, said it would pass. The overseer had locked us in for the night anyway. We couldn't have left even if everyone had agreed. Around midnight, people started dying. I don't know how else to say it. They just stopped breathing. I heard them gasping, heard them calling for help, but there was nothing I could do. I tried to help my mother, tried to get her to breathe, but she just stopped. I must have passed out. When I woke, it was dawn, and the air was clear, and I was surrounded by bodies. My mother, my baby sister Sarah, my grandmother, my cousins James and William, my friend Rose, 38 people dead in our quarters alone. Master Vernon came at sunrise with his sons and 3 white men I didn't know. They didn't check who could still be saved. They just started loading bodies into a wagon. Made those of us who survived help. We dragged our own family members, our friends, piled them in that wagon like cordwood. They buried everyone in a field on the edge of the property before noon. Made us dig the pit, made us cover them over. One of Vernon's sons said if we ever told anyone about what happened, we'd be whipped until we couldn't walk. Said it was disease that killed them, that it was God's will, and we should keep our mouths shut and be grateful we survived. But I will not keep my mouth shut. Not anymore. Those people deserve better than an unmarked grave and enforced silence. They had names, they had lives, they mattered. The testimony continued with a complete list of the 38 people who had died. Catherine copied every name into a notebook, preserving each one with trembling hands. Sarah Porter, aged 48. Sarah Porter the younger, aged 6. Rose Hamilton, aged 53. On and on, 38 names that had been carried in Rachel Porter's memory for almost 30 years, waiting to be spoken aloud, waiting to be written down, waiting to be remembered. If you're watching this, take a moment to subscribe to The Dark Room. These stories matter, these names matter, and by staying with us you help ensure they're never forgotten again. Below Rachel's testimony were others. Joshua Wright, who'd survived the incident on a different plantation, described similar scenes. The overseer told us later it was miasma, bad air from the swamps, he wrote, but I knew that was a lie. I've lived near swamps my whole life. That wasn't swamp air. That was something else, something poison that came through that one night and killed dozens of us. Another testimony from a woman named Mary Webb provided additional detail. I was 14 years old that night, she wrote. I survived because I'd been sent to the main house to help with kitchen work, and they had me sleep in the attic storage room. The room had cracks in the walls. I used to hate those cracks because they let in cold air, but those cracks saved my life. The poison air must have dispersed enough by the time it reached the attic that it didn't kill me. I just had a headache and felt sick to my stomach, but when I came down in the morning, 19 people from the quarters were dead. Catherine read testimony after testimony, each one adding details to the picture she'd been assembling. The survivors described the same sequence: the chemical smell, the respiratory symptoms, the sudden deaths, the hasty burials, the enforced silence. Several mentioned seeing plantation owners meeting in the days after the event, arguing about how to handle the situation, coordinating their response. One survivor, a man named Benjamin Cross, had been working in the main house and overheard a conversation that confirmed Catherine's darkest suspicions. Master Thornton was meeting with 3 other white men, plantation owners from nearby, he wrote. They were scared, I could tell, talking about insurance, about investigations, about what would happen if authorities found out. One of them said they needed to coordinate their stories, make sure no one reported the full count of dead. Another said they should spread the survivors around to different plantations so it wouldn't be obvious how many had died in one place. They were more worried about their money than about the people who died. Catherine left New Hope with pages of notes and a new understanding of what she was documenting. This wasn't just a natural disaster that had been inadequately recorded. This was a deliberate cover-up, a conspiracy of silence maintained by people who valued their property and reputation more than the lives of the hundreds of human beings who died under their control. She visited 8 more churches over the following months, collecting additional testimonies wherever they existed. Not all churches had records from the December 1859 period, but several did. By the time she finished, she documented testimony from 23 survivors representing 12 different plantations. The death toll these testimonies described exceeded 600 people. And these were only the plantations where survivors had eventually joined churches that kept written records. How many other plantations had experienced casualties that were never documented? How many other voices had been silenced not just by death, but by the systematic erasure that followed? Catherine added the survivor testimony to her research, carefully attributing each account, preserving the names of the dead that survivors had fought to remember. The document that emerged was no longer simply a scientific paper. It was a memorial, a historical reckoning, a demand that forgotten lives be recognized and honored. She and Raymond submitted their joint paper to the Journal of Southern Medical History in March of 1897. The title was straightforward: Mass Casualty Event Among Enslaved Populations in Eastern Texas, December 1859, Geological and Historical Evidence for Toxic Gas Release. The paper was 38 pages long, including maps, geological data, historical documentation, and survivor testimony. It concluded with a list of names, every individual whose death could be confirmed or whose name had been preserved in survivor accounts. 347 names, each one a person who'd lived and died and deserved to be remembered. The journal published the paper in its June 1897 issue, and then all hell broke loose. The response was immediate and divided. Academic reviewers praised the meticulous research and novel methodology. Catherine's combination of forensic analysis, archival research, and oral history was groundbreaking for the period. Raymond's geological theory provided a plausible mechanism that explained the observed evidence without resorting to speculation or conspiracy. Several researchers requested permission to cite the work in their own studies of historical disasters and burial practices. But the paper also generated fierce criticism from quarters that had nothing to do with scientific merit. Descendants of the plantation owners named in survivor testimonies were outraged. Catherine received angry letters accusing her of fabricating evidence to defame respectable families. Several letter writers threatened legal action if she continued to spread what they called malicious lies about their ancestors. The threats were specific, detailed, backed by the kind of legal language that made it clear these weren't empty bluster. One particularly hostile letter came from James Mayhew, grandson of Richard Mayhew, one of the plantation owners mentioned in survivor testimony. Dr. Brennan, the letter read, "Your recent publication represents a shameful attack on my family's honor based on nothing but hearsay and speculation. My grandfather was a respected businessman and Christian gentleman who treated his property humanely. To suggest that he participated in some conspiracy to conceal mass deaths is both offensive and libelous. I have consulted with attorneys regarding potential legal action. However, I am willing to forego such action if you publish a retraction and apology in the next issue of the journal. Failing that, you will hear from my lawyers." Catherine showed the letter to Raymond, who was equally troubled by the threats he'd been receiving. "Are you going to retract?" he asked quietly. "No," Catherine said firmly. "Everything in our paper is documented and sourced. I will not lie to protect people who valued property over human life." "They could sue you," Raymond pointed out. "Even if they don't win, it could ruin you financially. The court costs alone." "Let them try," Catherine interrupted. "We have Dr. Whitfield's journal. We have survivor testimony. We have the graves themselves. Let them explain in court why their ancestors buried hundreds of people in unmarked graves and never reported it. Let them explain that under oath in front of a judge, where their testimony would become part of the public record." James Mayhew never followed through on his legal threats. Catherine suspected that his attorneys had advised him that a lawsuit would only draw more attention to the historical record he wanted to suppress, that depositions and discovery would expose exactly the kind of documentation his family had spent decades trying to keep buried. Better to let the matter fade quietly than to drag it into open court, where journalists might start asking uncomfortable questions. But the controversy had consequences nonetheless. Several medical journals that had previously published Catherine's work declined her subsequent submissions without explanation. Social invitations dried up. Colleagues who'd been friendly became distant, offering polite excuses for why they couldn't meet for lunch or collaborate on research projects. She wasn't formally ostracized, but the message was clear. She'd crossed a line. She'd asked questions that polite society preferred not to answer. Raymond faced similar professional backlash. Senior faculty at the University of Texas suggested he should focus on less controversial geological research. His department chair warned that association with politically sensitive topics could harm his chances of tenure. There were important people in the state who were unhappy with the attention being drawn to old family histories. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if Dr. Foster redirected his considerable talents towards safer subjects. Neither of them backed down. Instead, they expanded their research. Over the next 3 years, they identified 22 additional burial sites, bringing the total to 60 confirmed locations across eastern Texas. The death toll documented in their research exceeded 800 individuals, and they knew this was likely a fraction of the true number. How many sites had never been discovered? How many had been found and covered over again without documentation? How many names had been lost forever because no survivor had lived to preserve them? They also identified 3 other potential gas release events from the same period. Smaller incidents in 1857 and 1861 that had caused livestock deaths and minor human casualties, but had been dismissed as local anomalies. Weather phenomena, swamp gas, divine punishment for sin, whatever explanation allowed people to avoid asking deeper questions. The December 1859 event appeared to have been the largest and most deadly, but it hadn't been unique. The geological conditions that had triggered it were still present. The fault line still ran through eastern Texas. The underground gas pockets still existed, sealed by rock formations that could crack under the right conditions. It could happen again. Raymond published a follow-up paper in 1899, detailing the geological mechanisms that could produce such releases, including maps of high-risk areas where underground gas pockets might still exist. He recommended monitoring and safety precautions for communities near known fault zones. His paper was largely ignored by state authorities, who saw no political benefit in acknowledging a natural hazard that might discourage development and lower property values. Catherine published several additional papers documenting burial practices, mortality patterns, and the systematic erasure of slave deaths from official records. She became a controversial figure in Texas academic circles, respected by some, reviled by others, impossible to ignore. Her work inspired younger researchers to examine forgotten histories, to seek out the voices that had been deliberately silenced, to treat enslaved people as human beings worthy of historical documentation rather than as property to be noted in ledgers and forgotten. In the autumn of 1901, Catherine received a letter that would lead to her most significant discovery. It came from a woman named Virginia Carpenter in Henderson, Texas. "Dear Dr. Carpenter, Brennan, the letter began, I am writing regarding your research into the events of December 1859. My father, Nathaniel Cooper, was enslaved during that period and survived the incident on the Willis plantation. He is now 70 years old and in declining health. He has asked me to contact you because he wishes to share his testimony before he dies. My father has never spoken publicly about his experiences, fearing retribution even after emancipation. But he has followed your research in the newspapers and believes you are someone who will treat his story with respect. If you are willing to visit Henderson, my father would like to speak with you. Catherine traveled to Henderson immediately, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She found Virginia Carpenter and her father living in a modest house on the edge of town. Nathaniel Cooper was indeed elderly, his body worn by decades of hard labor, but his mind was sharp and his memory devastatingly clear. I had been carrying this story for 42 years, he told Catherine as they sat in his small parlor. Figured it was time to let it go before I die. He'd been 8 years old on the night of December 1st, 1859, living with his mother and grandmother in the slave quarters of the Willis plantation. His account matched the others Catherine had collected. The chemical smell, the respiratory distress, the sudden deaths in the night, the hasty burials the next day, the threats to anyone who spoke about what had happened. But Nathaniel remembered something the other survivors hadn't mentioned, or perhaps hadn't known. 2 days after the poison night, he said, Master Willis had visitors. I was working in the yard clearing brush, and I could hear them talking in the study. They didn't know I was there, or maybe they didn't care because I was just a child. What were they talking about? Catherine asked gently. Money, Nathaniel said, insurance claims and whether to report the deaths. One man, I think it was Mr. Holloway from the next county over, said they couldn't report the full numbers because questions would be asked. He said if inspectors came and found that multiple plantations had lost so many slaves on the same night, they'd investigate for disease or poisoning or negligence. Another man, I didn't recognize his voice, said they should blame it on cholera or some other fever. But Master Willis said that wouldn't work because there'd be no illness before the night, no spread afterward. It didn't match disease patterns. People would ask questions they couldn't answer. Finally, they agreed to stay quiet, bury the dead without markers, spread word to other affected plantations to do the same. They would share survivors among their properties to distribute the labor loss, and they would tell anyone who asked that some slaves had died of winter fever, enough to explain why they were buying and selling to rebalance their workforce, but not enough to trigger investigation. Nathaniel paused, his hands trembling slightly. I never forgot that conversation, he said, the casual way they discussed it, like the dead were just numbers in a ledger, like the grieving families weren't even human. Did you ever learn what actually caused the deaths? Catherine asked. Not for certain, Nathaniel said, but I remember something else. About 3 months before the poison night, there had been a small earthquake. Nothing major, just enough to rattle dishes and scare the horses. And I remember going to the well the next day and noticing the water smelled different, sulphurous, like bad eggs. It cleared up after a week or so, but I remember thinking the earthquake had changed something underground. Catherine leaned forward, her pulse racing. An earthquake in September of 1859, somewhere around then, Nathaniel confirmed. I was just 8, so I don't remember exact dates, but it was before the first frost, maybe late September or early October. Catherine made careful notes. An earthquake would have created exactly the kind of geological stress Raymond had theorized might trigger gas releases. If there had been seismic activity 3 months before the December event, it could have fractured seal formations, created pathways for gas migration, set up the conditions for the later release when the cold front arrived. Is there anything else you remember? Catherine asked. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, after they buried our dead, Master Willis gathered all the surviving slaves together. He told us what happened was God's will, that it was punishment for sin, that we should accept it with Christian humility. Then he said if anyone spoke about it outside the plantation, they'd be sold away from their families. His voice hardened. That was the worst part, you understand. Not just that they let us die, not just that they buried our people without ceremony, but that they threatened us to keep us quiet. They took our dead, and then they took our voices. He looked at Catherine with fierce intensity. "That's why I wanted to talk to you. Because you're giving us back our voices. You're telling the story they tried to bury. You're saying our dead mattered, that their names should be remembered." Catherine had to wipe her eyes before she could respond. "Thank you for trusting me with your story," she said quietly. "I promise it will be treated with the respect it deserves." "I know it will," Nathaniel said. "That's why I called you here. That's why I'm telling you this now, before I die. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember." Before she left, Nathaniel gave her a small wooden box. Inside were 7 smooth stones. "After they buried our dead," he explained, "I went to the grave at night and left stones. 1 for my grandmother, 1 for each of my cousins, 1 for my mother's best friend, 1 for the baby who died in my mother's arms. I kept these 7 stones to remember them by. I'd like you to have them. Put them somewhere they'll be honored." Catherine accepted the box with trembling hands. "I'll make sure they're placed respectfully," she promised. She returned to Galveston and immediately wrote to Raymond about Nathaniel's testimony, particularly the detail about the earthquake. Raymond confirmed that U.S. Geological Survey records documented a magnitude 4.2 earthquake in northeast Texas on September 28, 1859. "This is the trigger," Raymond wrote back. "The earthquake fractured subsurface formations, creating pathways for gas migration. Over the following weeks, gas accumulated in underground pockets. Then the cold front in early December created pressure changes that forced the gas to the surface through multiple release points. The pieces had finally come together. They had a complete picture: geological cause, historical documentation, survivor testimony, physical evidence, everything aligned into a single terrible story." Catherine and Raymond published a comprehensive monograph in 1902, bringing together all their research from the previous 7 years. The book was titled "The Silent Catastrophe: Toxic Gas Release and Mass Mortality in Eastern Texas, 1859. It included detailed geological analysis, maps of all confirmed burial sites, complete reproductions of survivor testimony, and a list of every name they'd been able to document. 412 individuals whose deaths had been confirmed through testimony or physical evidence. The book's dedication read, "To the hundreds of enslaved people who died in the poison night of December 1st, 1859, and to the survivors who fought to preserve their memory against deliberate erasure." On the dedication page, Catherine placed 7 small photographs of the stones Nathaniel Cooper had given her. She'd had them photographed and then placed in a memorial garden at a black church in Henderson, where they remained as a permanent marker of the forgotten dead. Catherine Brennan died in 1927 at the age of 64. By then, her research had helped identify 73 burial sites across eastern Texas, documenting the deaths of more than 600 enslaved people in the December 1859 gas release event. Her work had also inspired a new generation of researchers to examine forgotten histories, to seek out the voices that had been deliberately silenced, to treat enslaved people as human beings worthy of historical documentation rather than as property to be noted in ledgers and forgotten. Raymond Foster continued their research until his death in 1932. He published several papers on natural gas hazards in Texas and advocated for better geological monitoring of populated areas near known fault zones. His work contributed to safety regulations that likely prevented future casualties from similar events. The burial sites Catherine and Raymond documented are still being discovered today. Every few years, someone excavating for construction in eastern Texas uncovers another cluster of bones, buried without markers, without ceremony, without official record. But now, when those discoveries are made, people know where to look for context. They consult Catherine's research. They check church records for survivor testimony. They contact descendant communities and historical societies. The bones are treated with dignity, given proper burial, honored as the human remains they are. And the names, those precious names that survivors fought so hard to preserve, they're being remembered. Churches across eastern Texas have created memorials listing the known dead from December 1859. Historical markers have been placed at several burial sites, acknowledging what happened and honoring those who died. The 7 stones Nathaniel Cooper saved for 42 years still rest in the memorial garden in Henderson. Around them, descendants of survivors have placed additional stones, each one representing someone who died in the poison night. Someone whose name might be lost, but whose existence is acknowledged. On the first Saturday of December each year, a ceremony is held at the Henderson Memorial Garden. Descendants gather to read the names of the dead, to share stories passed down through generations, to ensure that the silent catastrophe of 1859 is not forgotten again. Because Rachel Porter was right when she wrote those words in 1868, these people deserved better than unmarked graves and enforced silence. They had names, they had lives, they had families who loved them, they had dreams that were stolen from them, they had stories that should have been told. They mattered, and thanks to Catherine Brennan's determination, to Raymond Foster's scientific rigor, to the courage of survivors like Nathaniel Cooper, who refused to let the truth be buried, they are finally being remembered. The geological evidence confirms it was a natural disaster. A terrible convergence of seismic activity, underground gas deposits, and atmospheric conditions that created a lethal event across hundreds of square miles. The kind of disaster that, under different circumstances, would have prompted national mourning and immediate investigation. But the historical evidence confirms it was also a human failure. Plantation owners who valued property over people, who coordinated to conceal mass deaths, who threatened survivors into silence, who erased hundreds of lives from the official record as casually as they might erase a line in a ledger book. Both truths matter. Both deserve to be remembered. The unmarked graves of eastern Texas no longer keep all their secrets. When new burial sites are discovered, and they continue to be discovered even now, more than 160 years after that terrible December night, researchers know what questions to ask. They know to check for geological fault lines. They know to search church archives for testimony. They know to treat the dead with the dignity they were denied in their final moments. They know to remember December 1st, 1859, the night when more than 600 enslaved people across eastern Texas died gasping for air in the darkness, victims of both natural catastrophe and human cruelty, forgotten by design, erased by choice, until Catherine Brennan decided they deserved better, until their names were finally spoken aloud, until their stories were told. Samuel Hargrove, the man who started it all by uncovering those 17 bodies while digging the foundation for his barn, died in 1908. He never knew that his discovery would eventually lead to the uncovering of one of the largest concealed disasters in American history. He never knew that those 17 souls whose bones he'd found had hundreds of companions buried across the Texas landscape. He never knew their names or their stories. But on quiet nights when the wind moved through the cedar trees on his property, he'd still sometimes hear what he thought were whispers, and he'd stand on his porch, listening to voices he couldn't quite make out, feeling the weight of something that had happened long before he arrived. He was right to listen. Those whispers were real. They were the voices of people who died without anyone to mourn them, without anyone to speak their names, without anyone to acknowledge they'd ever lived at all. Until finally, decades later, someone did. The poison night claimed hundreds of lives, but it could not claim their humanity. It could not claim their dignity. It could not claim their right to be remembered. That victory belongs to the survivors who preserved the names, to the researchers who uncovered the truth, and to every person who has since said, these lives mattered, these deaths matter, this history matters, and it always will. Because in the end, that's all any of us really want. To be remembered, to have our existence acknowledged, to know that when we're gone, someone will say our name and remember that we were here, that we lived, that we loved, that we mattered. The people who died on December 1st, 1859, didn't get that in their own time. They were buried in unmarked graves and deliberately forgotten, but they're getting it now. Every name that's been recovered, every testimony that's been preserved, every memorial stone that's been placed, every ceremony that's held on the first Saturday of December. It's not justice. Justice would have been preventing their deaths in the first place. Justice would have been holding the plantation owners accountable for their conspiracy of silence. Justice would have been acknowledging their humanity while they still lived. But it's something. It's recognition, it's remembrance, it's the refusal to let them be forgotten again. And maybe, just maybe, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees in eastern Texas, those whispers Samuel Hargrove thought he heard are finally at rest. Because their stories have been told, their names have been spoken, their existence has been acknowledged. They are no longer silent. They are no longer silent. They are remembered, and they always will be.